Sorry?
Take out the flyer.
Yeah, yeah. Should we just put it here, or do you want to? Okay, I would like to welcome you all to this seminar. I'm very happy to see that so many of you have come, even though it's earlier than we normally have seminars. So that's great, but it's an important topic. So what the topic of the seminar, as you all know, is the EU's role in a more unstable world towards a shared grand strategy. And I think that we can agree that power politics has very much returned to as a character of international politics today. The world has become multipolar, where the liberal order and multilateralism is increasingly threatened from rising powers, but also from within the West itself. So the question that we want to ask today is, what kind of role can and will the EU play in such a context? As you know, the EU was built to overcome divisions internally within Europe, and on the idea that technical integration and economic interdependence would make war unlikely. So it's not really set up to be a foreign policy actor. But of course, over time, it has become an important global actor all the same, in development and humanitarian aid, in trade, climate negotiation, as a role model, setting standards in GDPR, environment, etc. And then also in crisis management and conflict prevention of different kind. It is in many ways a different kind of actor, but the question is it a global power? Can it be a global power, and if so, how? There are some ambitions, of course, with the global strategy. Now we see the new commission that promotes itself as a geopolitical commission, but will it succeed? So the question we would like to discuss today is, how will 2020 turn out for the Union, and what role will it pursue in the future? And we are very happy to have Professor and Director Sven Bishop here. He is one of the experts on this issue. He has recently published a book called European Strategy in the 21st Century. So he's the director for the Europe in the World program at the Egmont Institute, the Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels. He's also professor in international politics at Ghent University and honorary fellow of the European Security and Defence College. So we are very fortunate to have you here to talk about this issue. And with no further ado, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me. And good morning to everybody. As we were saying beforehand, in Brussels, it would not work, to meet so early. Not that we all sleep so long in Belgium, but we don't go out so early, I think, to attend the conference. So we're already happy at Egmont if we can get people at a 9:30 meeting. 8:30, we will not venture there. Maybe really brief word. I have two employers, as you heard. The University of Ghent is the best university in Belgium, but everybody knows that, so I will not elaborate. Egmont, the Royal Institute for International Relations, is the sister institute of NUPI, you can say. We are closely linked to our foreign ministry. We are actually physically located inside the Belgian foreign ministry, but mentally we are outside. So I just want to stress that we never speak for the kingdom. Frank Arnolds, the Belgian ambassador, is here, so he does speak for the kingdom, and I'm sure he will correct me or throw something at me if I go too far out of line. No. So just so that you know that you will hear the most individual expression of the most individual emotion. I think I agree what Pernille said. There's a growing awareness in Brussels that we have to think about the old-fashioned topics in a way. Great powers, geopolitics, spheres of influence. What is power and how do you use it? Can you use power in a sort of nice way, in a kind of benign way. And I think for a long time, maybe in the EU as such, certainly, and also in many EU member states, somehow the very idea of power was seen as bad. I think for a while even the idea of interest was seen as bad. There was always this idea that the point of EU foreign policy is just to be nice to people, you know, to go around the world and hand out money and set a shining example. But that's just not enough. That doesn't necessarily buy you influence. I could be nice to you and give each of you €100. You would probably take it. €100 is €100, but would you respect me for it? Probably not. You would probably say it's a bit strange, this morning's speaker, but got 100. And of course the member states also, they don't care about an EU foreign policy that's just about being nice. The member states want the union that defends interests. And I think that shift came about sort of 2012, 2013, and then accelerated. And I think now there's a very strong consensus that the point of EU foreign policy is to defend the interests of the union and the member states, and that they are very much actively shared interest, collective shared interests. That's really a sort of change in mindset, I would say. And now we have to think about, okay, if it's about great powers, are we a great power as EU? Is that something that we want to do? If the answer is yes, is that something that we are able to do? What does that mean? And can we be a distinctive kind of power that knows what power is, that knows what power politics is, but that somehow plays it according to its own rules, so while fully respecting our own values on which the EU and the member states is based. I think that's still the question that we're struggling with a bit, and the global strategy tries to find a middle way between maybe a too rosy idealism on the one hand, but also pure power politics on the other hand. So the EU calls it a principled pragmatism. Not the most catchy phrase, so it hasn't caught on, but it's sort of what it is. It's sort of, I sometimes call it the realpolitik with European characteristics. It's trying to find a pragmatic way to do foreign policy in the world as it is, flexible enough, pragmatic enough to adapt to circumstances, but trying to stay faithful in our foreign policy to how we organize things internally. That's how I see it. So I thought I'd make three points today. One about the context in which the EU now is operating. Two, about how the EU is, in my view, in my interpretation, trying to reposition itself into these great power relations. And three, about some of the instruments that the EU is trying to create to enable it to play that role. So, number one, the context. Again, I agree with Pernilla. I always agree with Pernilla. We're back in a world of great powers. In a way, that's just back to normal. Usually, if you look at the history of world politics, it's always a multipolar world. It's the exception if they were not in a multipolar world. So we have to get used to that again. What does that mean? And what makes it really difficult for us is that the one of the great powers with whom we have an alliance, the United States, not as EU, of course, but all EU member states, but one or either a member or a partner of NATO, the US, they are really changing their grand strategy. And I think you can really feel that in Europe also, that for the Americans, the order of priority has changed. I don't know if you have ever heard of Khrushchevstadt. Probably you haven't, because it doesn't exist. It's just called Berlin. But Saigon became Ho Chi Minh City, right? And this sort of to say that during the Cold War, it was always clear that if push came to shove, Berlin had priority over Saigon. The whole point was who will control Western Europe, and the other theaters were in a way secondary. And now I would say the order of priority has shifted. If I speak with any American colleague, regardless of political affiliation, be they academics or officials, their number one priority is always the rivalry with China, which is first and foremost playing out in Asia. So that, of course, does not mean that the US is about to abandon us. They remain a global power with global interests. I think most Americans maybe not the one really important guy who just did not get impeached, but most Americans realize that a stable and prosperous Europe is in the American interest. But at the same time, I think we are being seen in a much more instrumental way than before. So we're not just allies that deserve protection, we are also allies who are many of us in American eyes a bit free riders. You know, we should spend more on our own defense. But not only do we not spend enough on our own defense, we're also cozying up to the actors that the Americans see as their adversaries, China, Iran, and for some Europeans, Russia, right? And so there's a lot of irritation and frustration there. So we are less allies worthy of protection. We are rather sort of too reluctant free riders who have to be mobilized, who have to be cajoled into falling into line and supporting American strategy against China, against Iran, and so on and so forth. And I don't think that is going to change, you know, regardless of who wins the presidential elections in November this year in the US. The number one priority will remain China for the Democrats as for the Republicans. Two, I think even if the Democrats win, there will be a more transactional approach to multilateralism, including to NATO, I think. That is also a trend. The style may be different, right? Maybe rather than blocking the WTO, they would try to actually reform it. But I think the trend will be the same. And of course, the US is not there to defend the European economic or energy interest, right? The US is there to defend the US interest. Can't blame them for that. But this idea that somehow if it's good for the US, ipso facto it's good for us in Europe, I think does not hold true, certainly not from an economic point of view. So in this context, you know, the only one actor will defend the EU interest, that's the EU. So we have to really play our own role. And my argument is that we have taken a couple of decisions recently as EU that if you take them all together, begin to amount to a certain repositioning of the Union, setting it on its own path in international politics, distinctive from the US. Of course, still very much linked to, but not quite the same path. But we have to think this through now. I think there's a risk that we sort of get stuck halfway. We have started this repositioning, and we've gone far enough to mightily irritate the Americans already, but perhaps not yet far enough to now also gain the benefits from it. The benefits that I see is that one, the EU is better able to defend the European interest, and two, that we can play our own distinctive role in great power politics, which I would argue is a stabilizing role. That's a double benefit that I think we can expect from this repositioning, but we're not quite there yet. This is my first point, the context. Second point, what does this repositioning amount to in international politics and specifically in great power relations? I think it's best illustrated by the EU's China paper from March of last year, in which the Union said, look, for us, China is everything at the same time. It is still a strategic partner with whom, when interests overlap, we can cooperate, for example, on climate. Two, it is also an economic competitor, but that's, how to say, that's what capitalism is, right? It's about competition. So that's not necessarily bad, but of course we have to try to make this a fair competition and transparent and rule-based. But three, it is also a systemic rival. It all depends on the dossier at hand and how China behaves in that dossier. That was a clear message, first of all, to the Chinese, which I think they understood very well. It's saying to the Chinese that the EU also is going to be a bit more transactional, to use a buzzword now, than before. And until now, the EU was saying to China, our market is very open to you. Wouldn't it be nice if you would open your market to us? Now I think the EU is saying more, our market is very open to you. It would only be fair if you would reciprocate. If you don't, then we may have to reconsider some of our openness to you. And so far this has worked, because the last year's EU-China summit At first it looked to be, it was going really difficultly, but in the end actually, after this paper was published, a compromise was found, and the Chinese committed to quite firm engagements with a deadline, and the hope is that in the autumn of this year, when there will be a big EU-China summit in Leipzig, not only EU-China but 27 heads of states and state and government plus EU plus China, that we may finalize the bilateral investment treaty that we've been searching for a long time. I always say to any Chinese who I meet, this is a real test case. You know, if you now live up to your commitments, it will be seen by the Europeans as evidence that their more nuanced approach works. However, if you now don't do anything, you just pay lip service to it, then don't be surprised if the American view gains in Europe, and that we will also begin to see China in a more confrontational light. So you could argue that this is a really important year, in my view, for EU-China relations and for great power politics. I paraphrase the approach also as saying the default position is we will cooperate whenever we can, but we will also push back when we must. So the default position is not that China somehow is an adversary or an enemy. I'm not one of those who thinks that China is sort of, setting out for world domination. They're a great power and they do what great powers do, just like the other great powers do. And we must sometimes be careful that we don't judge an act by China differently from how we judge the Americans, even if they do exactly the same thing, because the US is democracy and China is not. But if in their foreign policy they do the same thing, can you attach a different moral judgment to that just because of the type of actor? I find that a difficult question. So the default position is we want to cooperate, but if you cross our red lines, we will also push back. The problem that I see is that qua EU, we're not yet so used to pushing back against others, that the culture, of course, is still very much of cooperation and partnership, and it's always easier to say, okay, let's just stay friendly. So we must really push back when necessary. The other problem is, of course, that very often we are too divided, and there's always one member state or other who happens to have some economic dossier at hand, who then will slow down or even block EU decision making. So there I see a certain risk in the repositioning. If cooperate when you can but push back when you must in practice becomes cooperation only, then we are doing the opposite of what we are trying to do. Because I think the idea is that we try to engage China, but in order to say to look, we want to engage, but there are certain conditions. But if it's only engagement without any pushback, then we actually encourage them in some of their more assertive policies, which is the opposite of what we are seeking. This statement, I also read it as a message to the United States, saying, look, we are allies, and of course our preference is always to defend the European interest together with the United States. But if on a specific topic the interests diverge, we also feel we are entitled to the freedom of action to then defend our interest in another way, possibly by cooperating with some of the other powers. And sometimes in an alliance you must be able to agree to disagree rather than slap sanctions on each other, which is very odd if you think about it, that because we have a different Iran policy, and we didn't change, we agreed on the policy, the US changed, and now European companies face American sanctions within allies, among allies. That is pretty bizarre in my view. And in other cases as well, there's a threat of sanctions. I think the message is also say, look, how the EU will treat other actors will depend on how these other actors behave to us. It does not just depend on how Washington assesses these other actors, right? It's not because Washington says that Iran is the enemy that therefore the EU will say, okay, Iran is the enemy. No, we will make our own assessment and it will depend on our relationship with that actor. So I think there's also the message, we want the freedom of action to have our own relationship on our terms with the other powers. So this calls for a more flexible relationship, a more flexible type of alliance. Again, the EU, I think, has effectively repositioned itself, but we don't always have the capacity to then bring it into practice. And Iran is a case in point. It's very clear that the EU sticks to its policy, but we have not been able in practice to shield our companies from American extraterritorial sanctions. The mechanism has been created, Instex, the companies don't trust it enough. So business with Iran has come to a standstill. Who benefits from that? Who fills the gap? Yeah, Russian and Chinese companies. So was that then the American objective? I'm not so sure. But there you see that we stake out our position, but by then not really being able to do it, yeah, maybe we have in a way at first undermined our credibility. But I do think that the Americans have in a way opened those sort of Pandora's box, because a lot of people are now thinking, yeah, well, we must be able to avoid this in the future. Must all the trade be in dollars, and so on and so forth. And in a way, this, if I were American, I would worry about this, because I remember a friend, an American diplomat, saying the real source of American power is not necessarily our defense budget, but it's the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency of the world and that so much trade happens in dollar. But if people begin to doubt that and begin to look for other ways, that will have a big impact on their power. We have to be careful, because if it's not the dollar, will it necessarily be the euro? We have to see how that goes. But something is brewing there. Maybe Russia could be a next case in point to some extent. I think the EU has been remarkably consistent and unified in its policy to Russia ever since the Ukraine crisis, the ongoing Ukraine crisis. But you see also that there are some differences about the right mix between deterrence and détente, to use the good old-fashioned terms, right? Nord Stream 2 is a case in point, very contentious. Again, you see that the US has already threatened sanctions, which again I find very odd. If you don't agree between allies, have a dialogue, but don't just throw sanctions at one another. Then there was President Macron's statement that we need some sort of new opening with Russia, which I think created a lot of unease in this part of the world, in this part of Europe. So I think we must be careful here that one, if we need a new opening towards Russia, it should really be an EU fully shared position, given how sensitive this is for the security defense of the Eastern European member states. So I hope that when Macron made this statement, he knew what he was aiming at, but I'm not sure, to be honest. That anyway, he wouldn't tell me, so there you go. I think for sure, even in Russia, many Russian academics, they feel that Russia should normalize its relations with Europe, because their foreign policy has become untilted. They are started to flirt with China, but actually doesn't work, because the Chinese don't need them. And if I were Russian, I would be a lot more worried about all the Chinese influence in my near abroad rather than the European influence. But as you know, because of the politics of this is not going to happen anytime soon. So I think objectively speaking, there is scope for a normalization if the Russians are willing to also offer concessions, of course. But politically speaking, I don't see it happen. So I'm not sure that now is the moment for a new initiative. But again, the point I want to make is that if the EU member states were to find consensus, then we ought to have also the freedom of action to do this on our terms. Because in the end, the EU is bordering on Russia in Europe, not the US. So a lot is moving here in these great power relations. Now, my third point is that the EU then also has created a set of instruments that would allow it to play the role that it is seeking. And I want to just briefly highlight three, and then we can see in the debate where you want to take it. One is about sort of securing our home base, and it's investment screening. There is a growing concern about maintaining the sovereignty of our decision making of the Union and the member states. And I think quite a few states have realized that maybe we have been a little bit too open when it comes to market access. Europe was one of the few places where foreign companies, foreign owners could buy themselves into nearly any sector without many limits. And now it started, I think, as a concern more about technology, intellectual property, and so on. It then became more a security and strategic concern also. So now we have an investment screening mechanism at the EU level. It is voluntary in the sense that you're obliged to report investment in a certain sector, but it remains in the end a national decision whether or not to allow it. But it does make it, it is important because for those who want to be a bit more careful, it enables you to do that. It's always easier to say, no, we are now implementing an EU policy rather than having to say this is a purely national policy. I think this is an important first step, but I do think also this is not the end point. In the end, this will have to become compulsory, I think, and I would say then also something to apply to candidates for accession. It would not make much sense to say I'm a candidate for EU membership, but just before I join, I massively sell out to the Russians and all the Chinese, and then I join the union. No, if you want to join, I think this is sort of thing that you should already apply beforehand. So it is not, I want to mention, because I think it's an important part of discussion, a part that I know little about it. So moving on to the next one. 2 is policies towards third countries, so not the great powers, but the rest of the world, so to say, focusing on Eurasia, for which the EU has now adopted the EU-Asia connectivity strategy. This is, of course, a reaction to China's Belt and Road Initiative, although some countries are also targeted by Russia and its Eurasian Economic Union, be it with much less success. Here, too, I think we should not be too alarmist, right? I mean, what are the Chinese doing? There's this massive investment in the infrastructure of connectivity with the aim, of course, of generating political influence and creating a political and economic situation in these countries that they target that favors the Chinese interest, right? Well, that's what great powers do. That's what we try in our own neighborhood policy. That's what the Americans try. So that's the game, you know? That in a way that's neither good nor bad. So I would say as long as China does not force any country to join BRI, and especially as long as if a country has joined it, China does not force you to finish your relations with the other actors, then this is just normal international politics, I would say, right? If you join the BRI until now, you don't disappear behind an iron curtain or a great wall, right? Which is good because, you know, Italy has an MOU with the BRI and still like to travel to Rome from time to time. All bishops must report to Rome occasionally, so do I. I've made that one before, I know. So what is the EU interest here, right? The EU interest is not, or the EU aim cannot be to kick the Chinese out. I mean, 1, it's impossible, and 2, it would be hypocritical because we too, as a EU, want more trade and investment with and from China, for sure. The EU interest is also not that we would like to dominate any of these countries, right? I mean, quite a few European EU member states have been colonial powers. We've dominated enough countries in our time. It was not always so nice, so except for Boris Johnson, nobody wants to return to empire. So our interest is that we do not want countries in Eurasia that matter to us to be dominated by one of the other powers either against their will. So the way I read the EU policy to say, okay, if in a certain country that matters to us, we find that the Chinese are gaining too much influence, well, then all we must do or can do is to put a better offer on the table. And that's the Asia connectivity strategy, to say, okay, look, by all means do business with China and or Russia. We are doing business with China and Russia, but don't put all your eggs in one basket. There is also a very interesting offer to be had from the EU, but the precondition is that you maintain a level economic playing field, and it's transparent, non-corrupt, and so on and so forth. Which also means the precondition is not that you are a nice democracy, because then unfortunately, it will not work. It will not fly. And so that I also read as a de facto kind of shift away from democracy promotion in our policy and more focus on hardcore interest, though that does not mean moving away from the human rights discourse. I think in practice then there grows a distinction between democracy promotion, which as a policy goal I find very unrealistic, but human rights promotion, which we must continue to pursue. So I think this is a good strategy. No, it's simple. Good strategies are usually simple. That's already one thing. The challenge will be, I think, to mobilize the means to invest in this. We don't necessarily need to spend as much on this as China does, because a lot of what China does is unproductive investment. But they do it for strategic reasons. And of course, the Chinese government can force a company to make an investment, even if it's not economically viable. Obviously, the EU cannot do that. So we'll have to tease out viable investment opportunities that also suit our interest, and then mobilize private and public means. The EU has concluded a partnership with Japan to that end, which makes sense. It will make it easier to reach the scale, but it's still going to be, I think, a hefty challenge to mobilize sufficient means to make a significant impact in these countries. That really is, an offer at the scale of what the other powers offer. So to be continued also. Maybe this approach, the focus on connectivity, could inspire EU policies towards other regions. For example, towards our southern neighborhood, I think the EU has become a little bit too defensive also in the discourse, right? What's it all about? It's about migration, right? The point of the southern neighbors is that we want them to remain neighbors, your neighbor stays there. and that is maybe too unidimensional, and I think the new High Representative is seeking to take an Africa initiative, and maybe the connectivity agenda could be some inspiration. Final instrument that we have created then in the defense field, we have launched 2 instruments, PESCO, Permanent Structured Cooperation, between member states, and the Commission will create a European Defence Fund. This is exactly what we need. I've been a great defender of it from the beginning, because the armed forces of most EU member states have just become too small scale to create any significant additional capability by themselves. So even if everybody in the EU tomorrow would spend 2% of GDP on defense, that would not make that much difference in terms of capability if everybody would spend it separately in their own corner, because there are many capability areas in which you need scale to make an impact, right? Belgium, even if miraculously we would spend 2% on defense this year, but yeah, we're still not going to have strategic transport, satellites, drones, deployable headquarters. The strategic enablers where we have the most urgent shortfalls in our military arsenals, these are all areas that can only be filled by pooling of means, by pooling our defense effort between 10, 12 member states or more. Otherwise, we will forever be dependent on the US military to project the military power that we have. And that is the point for me of PESCO. Now, PESCO has started. There are now 47 capability projects. But my view is that we should not forget that PESCO is about much more than doing capability projects together. This is the necessary step, right? We need to, first of all, harmonize our requirements and equip our armed forces with the same equipment, and then design, build, and procure that equipment together. That will already save an enormous amount of money on our defense budgets. But it should not end there. If you have then all the same equipment, but afterwards you equip purely national units with it, that's not sufficient. Also, you need the move from cooperation, interoperability to real integration, and I see that playing out at 2 levels. One is at the level of smaller groups of member states. I'll give you a new example. Belgian Army, so land force. We have 1 motorized brigade now. There used to be 2. NATO would like it to be 2 again. That's also what the land force wants, but that will happen, but it will take time because simply there are no recruits. So for the moment we have 1 brigade. Now, the usability of that Belgian brigade is limited. The brigade itself is obviously excellent, but we do not have all the support units around it anymore, right? Because if you would want to deploy that brigade, you need air defense, for example, which we don't have. And you need so many different combat support and combat service support units around the motorized brigade that we will never have all of that, which means that actually the usability of that brigade is limited. However, Belgium will now embark on a very deep bilateral cooperation with the French Armée de Terre, with the French Land Army. We will buy French vehicles, but we will also copy French doctrine and organization. And if our one brigade can then be permanently anchored in a bigger French structure that can ensure all the support units that you needed, then suddenly our brigade becomes 100% usable. Then you can use it in all scenarios, the same brigade, because it's anchored in a bigger framework. That I think is the future. Belgian-Dutch naval cooperation is a similar example. Dutch-German army cooperation is another example. We need more of this. So this is not just being interoperable, this is about integrating on a permanent basis. That's level one. Now level two is strategic enablers. There are many areas in which cooperation between just 2 or 3 or 4 states will not cut it, right? If you want to launch a satellite program, you need 10 or 15 member states. If you want to build a new fighter aircraft or a new transport aircraft, you need 15 or more member states. So that's the second level, that these clusters of deployable units will have to be supported by commonly owned enablers, commonly owned by really big clusters, right? There will be several clusters that have, for example, deployable brigades, but there will be probably only one drone cluster, one satellite cluster, and so on and so forth. So that ought to be the next step. A good example ought to be FCAS, the Future Combat Air System. The idea that the next generation European fighter aircraft would be a Franco-German project, Franco-German-Spanish for the moment. Obviously, to make that economically viable, you need many more countries, right? And this is the compromise that has to be sought. The French and the Germans say, okay, we're not going to negotiate the requirements, the specifications of an aircraft with 25 PESCO states. That's never gonna work, right? I don't know if you've ever seen this episode of The Simpsons in which Homer designs a car and then it would probably end up like that. So they don't want to bring it to PESCO in an early stage. But I think the smaller states, or the not quite so big states, also have to be realistic. Is it necessary that Belgium co-decides the specification of that fighter aircraft? Probably not, right? So we can probably accept that if the French and the Germans and the Spanish, with maybe the Italians and the Brits included, say this is what it's going to be, then it's probably good enough for the Belgian Air Force too, right? If the French and if the Armée de l'Air and the Luftwaffe can use it, it's probably good for our Air Force as well. So this could be the deal, I think, that this kind of projects, you create a core group where you set the specifications, and once that's done, then you bring it to PESCO, so you can attract the mass that makes it economically viable. Of course, also meaning that some of the defense industry of the others will have to get their part to play, even though inevitably there will have to be more consolidation. So everybody needs everybody in this. It can work. And then of course there's a debate about third country participation, which I'm sure somebody will bring up in the Q&A. So to wrap it up, again, I think a lot is going on in EU foreign and defense policy. I think many important things have been set in motion. And I think the challenge is now to make sure that we keep going and that we think all of this through and that we integrate it into all relevant policies to make sure that our new position does not just irritate the Americans, right? I don't care so much about this, you know. My point of view is this: one, with the current president, he will always be irritated, right? Whether you do or you don't, and if he's happy now, then 5 minutes later he'll be unhappy. So, but that's specific to this guy. But by and large, I would say they will be irritated. I would say just ignore that, just do it. and then the results of what we do will speak for themselves. But then we have to do it. If, however, we talk about it and we irritate them, but in the end we don't do it, yeah, that's a bit silly. But if you want to do it, yeah, just explain to them, this is what we're doing and why, and we are going to do it. And if the results will be there, that will automatically lead to a new sort of relationship, I would hope. I obviously could talk a lot more because I have a 30-hour course on this at university. But as Pernille said, I have written it all down in my European strategy in the 21st century. Don't worry, I don't bring any copies ever. You know, I'm not an encyclopedia salesman, but I left the flyer there if you're interested, and it even gives you a 20% discount at these ridiculous academically priced books. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sven. This was very interesting. And I am really kind of impressed that you talk so lively without notes and no PowerPoint.
No PowerPoint.
No PowerPoint, of course, but even no notes. So this was really good and really interesting. I forgot, I was told by the administration here that I always have to say in the beginning that this event is streamed. So now I'm saying it now before we start the discussion so that you know that this is also online streaming. You knew from before. So, now we will open the floor for questions. I think I will, while you sign up, I will start with a few questions myself. Because all you say, I agree with all you're saying, but I just wonder where are the kind of main challenges for this to happen, or this to take place, to moving in that direction. Because as I see it now, I mean, this is, many steps are taken in the right direction, but at the same time you have internal divisions in the EU, and there are, not all member states are aligned in kind of, or agree on what the direction should be. So I don't wonder how to overcome that problem. That's the one question. And the other one is what do you make of this new commission, which is promoting itself as a geopolitical commission? What do you think is the purpose of that, and what do they really mean? Because it's quite new. And the third thing is of course third country participation, as I take this right away. It's of course of interest to Norway, but not only to Norway now. I mean, now Brexit has happened, so this will of course be important for the EU, but also for Great Britain, especially when it comes to these issues of, when you talk about PESCO, defense, EU defense, of course, the European Union will be dependent on some kind of cooperation with Great Britain. And that is, of course, of interest for Norway as well, because that could, and Norway is very eager to participate in these formats. So that is also, and I think the last thing which is linked to that is, how do you see the EU developing more in kind of a more flexible integration direction, or because this is very much a topic in the academic literature now. What is EU developing in more? Is it a more differentiated actor? Will that be the trend also in this area? So yeah. So you can pick and choose and sign up while he is responding. Yeah.
I mean, on the first one, I think, of course, there are on the face of it a lot of divisions or a lot of disunity. But my feeling is that, objectively speaking, in talking foreign policy now, the positions are not so different, right? If you look at the policy vis-à-vis China, nobody is arguing for a decoupling of Europe from the Chinese economy. It's just saying that, look, there are certain sectors that are sensitive, that are linked to public utilities, are linked to sovereignty, to security. There, maybe we must put a cap on foreign ownership, which is not only China. For me, foreign is foreign, so it's non-EU. So nobody's seeking to decouple that. And if you look at the numbers, actually, because there is often this impression, but the Chinese very skillfully also help to create, that they are massively investing in Eastern and Southern Europe. But if you look at the numbers, one, the Chinese investment, actually 90% of it goes to UK, or not anymore, and to France and Germany. and the peanuts go to Eastern and Southern Europe. And even within these countries, it's just a very few percentage of the foreign direct investment that they receive. The great bulk of it is from the rest of the EU and from the United States. But there's this very skillfully created idea with prominent bilateral visits and so on that China is calling the shots and it's so massively important for their economic development. And we must also, I think, make it clear, well, yeah, by all means, we also want Chinese investment, but actually this is not what drives your economy. So in the end, I think it's not really so far apart. But you have to get over the politics of that. And in defense, it's the same thing. There's this difficult debate about what France has now dubbed strategic autonomy. But in the end, there's nothing new, right? When the European security and defense policy, which then became the common security and defense policy, was created in 1999, this was the point. This was a Franco-British initiative, and the point was the ability to do autonomous operations. So there is nothing new here in the ambition, except maybe now there's the strong idea that we should also have defense industrial autonomy, and that greatly upsets the Americans. But that's a bit hypocritical. I say to every American, the day that the US Air Force buys some Airbuses, we can talk. Until then, yeah, don't prevent us from building our defense industry, because our market is massively open to you. The other way not. So the interesting thing is that even those who are most in favor of the EU instruments that we have now created, PESCO, there's actually a consensus now that the point of these instruments is not just to generate the kind of capabilities that we would need for EU operations, or what have been the type of EU operations until now, and to look only at a part of the participating states' armed forces that they have declared available to the EU. No, PESCO looks at the whole of participating states' armed forces and generates capability projects also to help them meet their NATO targets. So my argument is the best way for the NATO allies who are also EU member states to meet their NATO targets is precisely to use PESCO and the EDF, and that will help them to generate capability much faster and at a much more significant scale. So again, there's no real contradiction here, but the politics of it are, of course, more tricky. What is meant by geopolitical commission? I liked the signal, I must say, and for me it's saying an awareness of this international context where you have great powers and regional powers that use all instruments of power, political, economic, military, and that we have to know this, we have to understand what power is, and then play our own role. I think
there is a move away from what the Commission has been criticized to be too technical. So now they want to show that. I mean, in the neighborhood policy, that was the case. That in the Ukraine crisis, it was criticized for being maybe too technical in the neighborhood policy, and now taking geopolitical kind of issues back in and be concerned about that might be what they want to.
Yeah, and I think the Juncker Commission, certainly in defense field, already really started to play that role, and now you see this sort of amplified and accelerated. On the third countries, I mean, my position is that we ought to be really flexible in this vis-à-vis other European states. So Norway and certainly also the UK. I mean, if you're going to do capability projects, the problem is always to find the scale, to find enough states who are willing to join to make it economically viable. Who is a potentially big customer? For example, if you build a fighter aircraft, well, the UK, they are going to maybe buy a sizable number of them. So I would say that we should be very flexible and bring in the UK, and just make case-by-case arrangements. Because there's this big fear of, but if you give a special deal to the UK, then others will ask a special deal, which in the mind of most means Turkey, and nobody wants to give it to Turkey. But I would say, okay, then Turkey asks him, we'll think about it. No. Moving on, right? Norway will ask him, think, okay, yes, why would anybody else have an automatic legal right to the same treatment? I don't see that. But the UK will then also, my view is that British defense industry will need it, because the Brits have now, with Sweden, launched their own fighter aircraft project, Tempest, I mean, this is not gonna fly, literally and figuratively. This is not gonna happen, right? That's too small a cluster. The risk is that if they persist in this, that they will also kill FCAS. And that ideally you need to merge the two. You need to bring the Brits on board into FCAS, because otherwise the risk is there will be neither FCAS nor Tempest, and we will forever be buying, I don't know, F-35, F-36, F-30, I don't know what the next numbers will be. That's a political choice. If you're fine with that, okay. But if you want to maintain some European centers of technology and excellence, then maybe we should go for the European way.
Now we have a few questions. Yeah, first here.
Thank you. My name is Odd Gunnar Skagestad. I have a couple of questions. No, not a couple. I was tempted to raise a number of questions, but I've got one in particular concerning the relations between the EU and China, and especially what could be done and how EU should act in order to, let's say, counter the challenges posed by Chinese penetration and eventually possibly domination in world markets. And you mentioned especially well, there are some especially sensitive sectors in investment, which of course is very important. But I didn't hear you say anything about the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And in my view, when you say that the best way to counter the Chinese, let's say their active policies, would be to put a better offer on the table. How could that be done specifically with regard to the road and belt, or the Belt and Road Initiative? You can't go out and offer the kind of loans that the Chinese government does to various states like Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Djibouti, etc., etc. So how do you envisage what you could do in that respect?
I mean, we cannot swamp them with money and that kind of loans, of course, but you can offer what I think where we can make a difference is to propose projects that create durable and sustainable economic development also for the country itself. And again, we have to make the point that it's in the target country's interest to diversify and not to put all their eggs in one basket. And the example that you mentioned, like Sri Lanka, I think has also been a wake-up call for quite a few other countries. In my view, this will also be somewhat of a pendulum movement, because the Chinese role is still relatively fresh and new, right? And there's still somewhat a new kid on the block. I think quite a few countries, yeah, they are eager to try, but we will also see a move back here and there. And if you're a third country, in a way, it's not too bad. Now you have more options. You can also play them off one against another. You can say to the Europeans, yeah, but the Chinese, they are offering me this, and vice versa. But I don't think any country is sort of seeking to be dominated by the Chinese. And that I think is precisely our chance, that maybe we present it too much as a rollover, which it is not, I would say. And the Chinese are also discovering some of the difficulties, right? I mean, one of the key, the pivotal states in BRI is Pakistan. The Chinese are discovering what the Americans could have told them. Pakistan is the ally you wish you never had sometimes. You know, they're bloody difficult. Can I say that when it's streamed? I mean, your basic point is right. I said it. It will be a challenge for us to mount an offer that is interesting and of significant scale. But we do have the instruments. Maybe what we should try to do, I think, also as EU, is to use. We already spend a lot of money, but not, in my view, always in a very purposeful and linked up manner. That we should align it more with our foreign policy objectives, what we already do, and maybe spend even more time on looking at the external role of our own public instruments, such as the European Investment Bank. We're always complaining about state-owned Chinese actors, but maybe to some extent we should also look at our own union-owned instruments and whether we should not give a bigger role to them in this sort of game.
My name is Kjell Stamnes. I'm an independent here. A question also regarding the relation between EU and China. You elaborated a little bit about the possibility to introduce a red line strategy and also then linked to a pushback strategy. In which areas do you think it could be possible that EU would draw a red line? And the second question, is it realistic to have a real common pushback strategy which have effects?
Well, let's say in the security and defense area, one clear issue is the South China Sea, right? Where the Chinese, not a shot has been fired in the South China Sea, but the result is the same in a way as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right? The Chinese have militarized, have created a fait accompli on the ground and on water, and have basically are pretending that they have annexed this now to their national territory. And that is clearly a red line that has been crossed. Now, it's not as if we are gonna literally push them back out of there, but as long as the other countries who also claim some of the same water, as long as they stick to their claim, then I think it's also ought to be our policy to support that diplomatically and militarily. This is not an EU role, but individual member states also take part in freedom of navigation operations. And I think we should continue to do that. There is a certain idea to Europeanize that, which I would support, but it will be tricky. Of course, again, some individual member states, they prioritize their short-term interest, and that massively undermines, of course, any potential pushback strategy. That's what we saw after the Permanent Court of Arbitration had its verdict, right, on the Philippine case against China. But that would be one example. But there's other examples in the economic sphere, and actually, you have the power to do that, right? Because China will, of course, try to defend its interest. It will try to see how far it can go. But the EU is also a real economic great power, and if the EU allies teams up with other actors in negotiations, you can actually bring the Chinese to accept certain limitations. So it is a realistic strategy, but of course it's always preconditions on a sufficiently unified position. That goes without saying. But the Chinese also, I think, don't want to fight on too many fronts at the same time, and that also has, in a way, Trump has helped us, I think, because with the so-called trade war, and that is their priority concern for China. It's not us; we come after that, but it has helped us to some extent. They say, okay, we're not also at the same time going to open another front with the Europeans, and in a way, I think that helped us to have the deal that we had last year at the EU-China summit, which again now the Chinese will have to prove. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. They now have to do it and to implement it.
And thank you for a very interesting talk. I have two questions. I very much agree with you that this change in EU foreign policies seem to be kind of driven by geopolitical changes linked to China growing and a change in US foreign policies. But I was wondering what this kind of new EU foreign policy would look like in practice, because it seems to me that the EU is kind of, or you say that the EU is caught in this dilemma between cooperating with China to kind of uphold the multilateral order in trade, climate, etc. on the one hand, but then the traditional EU foreign policy on the other hand, cooperating with the US and being its kind of junior partner. So trying to balance this, might this not even result in non-action in a sense, like we have seen in Syria, Libya, other conflicts? That would be my first question. And the second is, I'm wondering how much this really has to do mostly with a change in US foreign policies. If the US had stick to its traditional upholding on the liberal world order would EU policies have changed?
Yeah. To start with that one, I think yes, because I think what you have is a longer-term trend that has just been accelerated by the Trump administration. In a way, you could say what is surprising is not that there is now a certain divergence, that it took so long to emerge. Because you could say once the Cold War ended, that was the logical trend to develop, right? I would say that, simplifying, right? But you could say that if it's good for the US, it's good for Europe. It was probably true from about 45 to 65, thereabouts, right? It was really almost true like that. Then there were some divergences, certainly in the economic field, some in the political field, but in the end, because of bipolarity, it kept us all together. But once bipolarity ended, then it's logical that the order of priority of the interest begins to shift. But it took longer than expected to see that, and it's probably also linked to the prominence of China. So I think this is a deeper trend that it's logical, given how the US sees its role in the world, that they view the rise of China quite differently from us. And because they prioritize that may influence how they see Russia. Whereas for us, it's different, right? Where the shock that we had in 1945, then the Americans are getting that shock now to some extent, right? We realize in 1945 we're no longer number one, right? We may at most be number two as deputy sheriffs of the US. The Americans thought, right, 89, 91, the end of history, right? History has ended and has reached its logical endpoint in the combination of democracy and capitalism, and soon everybody will see the light and adapt that system. And for a while that seemed to be true, maybe, and then they realized suddenly history has not ended. The Chinese have just opened a new chapter. There you go. And I think that is a bit of a shock, and that even China might become a real peer competitor. So they're not the number one, right? And that is psychology also in my view. So I think this would have happened anyway. But of course, Trump has accelerated some of these trends. But I think they are the trend. Now, divergence does not mean that somehow we will break away from each other. My point is just that you will have to manage this more actively, right? You cannot start from the assumption that, Europeans and Americans, we will automatically agree. No, you will have to manage this a lot more proactively than before to make sure that you stay convergent enough to be able to act together when necessary. That's my point. Is this feasible? It is feasible. It requires, it may be difficult for Washington to accept that we play that role, but I think we have played that role for a long time already in the economic sphere. It's just that now it becomes also more political. The Syria, Iraq, Iran recently, I would interpret differently. The failure of the EU to be very, I think there we did not, we just played a very reactive role because there is no EU strategy. That for me is one of my main criticisms. For me, this is a big gap that there was no, I'm not sure there is one now, there is no view on what is the political future that we would like to see in Syria. What is the future political order, the regional order for the Middle East, and how will we ideally see a stable regional order that Iran and Saudi Arabia can live that? And if you don't know what your desired end state is, then you cannot play a proactive role. So we were purely reactive. And there's been a lot of criticism of the new team for that, which I think is unfair because it's the previous 5 years. We've been militarily in the region since 2014 when Obama created a coalition against IS, right? It's then that we should have done this, and you cannot now blame the new team for that. But now it's up to them, of course, to rectify this and develop a political view also that would allow us to play the role. You could see with the Berlin conference on Libya that actually you have the convening power to take an initiative if you want to. And the irony is that the Global Strategy 2016 actually said we ought to have a dialogue between Iran and the GCC countries. So we know that, but we just don't have the feeling that we try to do it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for a great talk. Two questions, if I may, on the security side. First, on the third country approaches, maybe it's a bit technical, but from a Norwegian approach to European Defence Fund and PESCO has been through the internal market. So there's probably not a third country in a way because they're already part of it. The question is that viable in the future? Will it be able to continue within the internal market framework, or will it be out in other spheres where Norway actually will be a third country? Secondly, it's a bit more political. Your defense integration, if you're going to have really integrated units, requires that you actually have to either trust that those you're integrated with will agree when to use them, or you will need some kind of a majority voting, right? So my question, your assessment of the political, how politically ready are European governments to actually, surrender sovereignty over their own troops in this regard? Thank you.
The first one, without going really into the technicalities of it, but I think my view is we should just have a country-by-country approach for this, and Norway's need different because it's in the internal market, and I think we ought to make a tailor-made approach, and the UK will have a different approach. That depends on where we will land with the negotiations, of course. So that was just my view, case by case, country by country. The political question, I think, the way you organize the integration, you can still create a lot of flexibility at both levels, right? At the level of the big clusters with the strategic enablers, in a way, the more countries are in it, the more easy it is to be flexible about this. We already have European Air Transport Command. It's not a real integration, so you have national transport fleets, but EATC coordinates their flight movements. It's very simple. If you know that Belgium needs to pick up a parcel in Kinshasa, in Congo, and the French need to deliver a parcel in Brazzaville, instead of sending two planes, right? That one goes there empty, come back full, and one goes full and come back empty. You coordinate, you send one aircraft. So it's as simple, as basic as that. But it happens that if you ask to support a specific operation, that one country says, no, I'm against this operation, I don't want any involvement. But if you have sufficient countries participating in it, it actually gives you the flexibility to say, okay, we will use your assets then for other things, and we have enough assets from the other countries to support the operation that we are doing. So it actually gives you a flexibility, this big cluster. So my view is that one of the existing projects is the drone project, for example. Suppose it works and delivers, and we design, build, and acquire these new drones. You could say, okay, now Belgium financed 20, so we get 20. The French and Germans financed 100, they each get 100. Well, probably smaller. Or you could say, well, let's keep them together, right? For accounting purposes, Belgium can be the owner of X drones. You may even paint a little Belgian flag on them. But we will operate all of them as if they were one fleet. So you only build one command structure for it. You only need one training and maintenance infrastructure. And so you have a collectively owned fleet, not EU owned, but owned by the member states who paid for them, that will support those member states who happen to be doing operations. And again, if you are enough member states in it, if one member state would say, yeah, but I really don't want to be a part of this or that, then you organize around it. I think it's feasible. Now, at a smaller level of clusters, yeah, you can still, how to say, if the national building blocks are big enough, that gives you enough integration, right? In the Cold War, what did we do? The smallest national building, I'm talking army now, land force. The smallest national building block was actually the Army Corps, right? Even Belgium alone contributed what was then called the first corps in Germany. Is also the only corps, but military units need a number. So the first Belgian corps in Germany, 80,000 troops. That was the smallest national building block. So like an almost totally autonomous unit. And you had some multinational support unit, think AWACS, right, NATO, and of course the NATO command structure. Now, of course, the smallest national building block is much smaller than a corps, right? The problem is that many of us think too small, right? The average European country, if you're thinking about joining an operation, you're thinking, yeah, we could send a battalion, But that's already a lot, and then rotation don't have. Yeah, maybe we'll send a company, and some countries even send half companies, right? That of course is too small, right? And then you think level of ambition, like this idea of France and Germany to have the crisis response operation core. Let's build a brigade, but you don't need the EU to build a brigade because Belgium alone still has at least a brigade. So I would argue. Today, the logical smallest national building block is the brigade, with a few exceptions. You don't expect Malta or Luxembourg to field the brigade, but what every member state should be able to put into the field is one brigade. That's the building block, but not every country, as I said, has all the support units around that. So you create it such that you can guarantee that if one country deploys its brigade, that the others will help it with the support structures. But it's not because country A deploys the combat forces that country B and C have to deploy the combat forces also. So again, I think there's flexibility there that we already have between Belgium and the Netherlands with our naval integration. Everything is integrated, but the ships remain purely national, right? A ship has a Belgian flag and a Belgian crew, or a Dutch flag and a Dutch crew. The other answer to this is maybe a bit of sophistry, but it's saying, but who does national operations anyway? You know, is there any operation that Belgium does alone without any integration with others? Yeah, the National Day Parade. Okay. And the only guys we need the defense attachés, they have to come and watch it, right? But that's it. So in a way, this is not new. Just now it's always ad hoc, operation by operation. And here you would just make it more permanent. Huh? And maybe I'm going on, but you could link it to this French initiative of the European Intervention Initiative, right? What are the French trying to do? They're building sort of a pool of willing allies, right? And they're saying, look, they are building like working groups on different areas or issues, right? Some fun groups. There's a Caribbean working group, I think. There's a Sahel working group, maybe a bit less fun. And so they are trying to think in advance, okay, what do we think is our responsibility here as Europeans? If A or B happens, what do we think is up to us to do? And what would then be the scenario? I think this makes perfect sense as an exercise. I would have liked to see it inside the EU, but okay, we're doing now outside. And my argument is, if this group of countries agrees that more or less this is what we ought to be able to do if A or B happens, this then should inform this military integration. This should then steer which package are you building. You know, I would argue that the countries who are in EI2, if they're really willing to do it, should then be the countries, the same group that goes furthest in building these integrated force packages. And so if this all works, then I think you may end up with a sort of de facto core group within the bigger PESCO group. I would not institutionalize that. I would just let it happen. But that's how I can see PESCO work. Maybe a question to your flexible integration, because yeah, you're not going to do a lot with all 25, but maybe you will end up with 10 or 12 or so who are the core of the core, so to say, who would go further, then the others can see what they do or not do in a later stage.
You said that the EIE or the EI2 intervention initiative, I mean, you would prefer to have it inside.
Yeah.
But isn't it also kind of a good thing that is outside that create more flexibility in order to which country you can include? And it also has a different objective. It has this kind of building a strategic culture. So it could also eventually kind of be of use for the EU to be more coordinated, more, and also how to easier to kind of have this third country participation.
Yeah, but that's a self-created problem. And the French army is we have to do it outside the EU because we want to take the UK on board. But the reason because the UK cannot be on board if it's inside the EU is because France doesn't want that. So they have created a problem which they claim EI2 is solving. I would say no, just be flexible and open this to by invitation to countries like the UK and Norway, and you could do it inside. Because I do think that to make the most of this very useful initiative, you would have to link it up to capability development, which is then happening in the EU. Of course, to say whether or not to do an operation, that would always remain a sovereign decision, right? So, because someone asked about qualified majority voting, I always say we could do, in my view, you could introduce QMV tomorrow in CFSP, in foreign policy. I don't see any objective obstacle to that, right? But in defense, as long as your troops are on the national payroll, you will have a veto on their deployment on operations. That's clear, right? If ever your troops will be on the EU payroll, then you can deploy them by QMV. You know? That's a European army, really. If your troops are on the payroll of the EU, then it's a European army. What I can imagine as an intermediate step is that, for example, if you would build, let's say, an integrated drone command, that maybe you would have troops who are on a sort of payroll of this agency, this unit that is funded by ex-member states who have joined it. You know? And then that group of member states can decide how they use that capability, maybe with a certain flexibility. All that can be arranged, I would say.
Okay, we have three more questions. First time, maybe we take them, all questions, and then you can,
My name is Bendik Rugås from Borealis Productions. And I should add for that, coming from the high north, that piece of information for you, sir. Today is the Sami National Day. So salute to the Sami people. You mentioned that, and also thank you very much for a really refreshing and enlightening presentation. I liked it. You mentioned our great ally across the waters to the west, and with a special way of, well, some would say bullying people into doing things, and if they are not sort of agreeing. And you also mentioned that this should be sorted out in another way. I got it that way, between allies. And just out of curiosity, have you had, or do you expect to have any sanctions on your part for this book? Thank you.
Okay, we take the two other questions as well. Here and then there. We have a mic.
I'm Niels Ødegaard, newspaper commentator. We have talked a lot about China, not much about Russia. Russia is the border of Europe, and it's part of Europe. Can you indicate how you estimate the possibilities of a joint and efficient EU policy towards Russia?
My name is Ola Storeng, like Nils Morten previously with Aftenposten. I used to deal in the economics field, so I'm not an expert, but I'm fascinated by the fact that we've had this discussion of the new world of power politics with no references to the internal crises of the EU, which is like internal cohesion, perhaps within countries, between countries, and we've hardly mentioned Brexit. And you could also argue that some of the internal crises of the EU have been linked to EU or integration overreach when the ambitions have been the biggest in moving competences that used to be national to the EU level, common currency. You could call it also common border policy in terms of the Schengen Dublin system, if you like. And normally when you speak about the core institutions of a national state, you certainly also think about defense and foreign policy. And here it seems like your suggestion is, oh, here's another good field where we could expand. Sounds like the elites are still thinking differently from other people.
Well, yeah, I guess I should take it in a flattering way that somehow I'm part of the elite. I'm not sure that's true, but I'll take them in reverse order. I mean, in a way, for me, it's the most obvious that we should now also integrate foreign policy and defense policy, because I would argue that we only maintain the illusion of a national foreign and defense policy, because there is no real. I mean, what is the China policy of Norway, right? Of course, you can have an opinion about China, just like I as an academic can have an opinion about China. Will that have a lot of impact on China's policy? Probably not, right? What is the Russia policy of Belgium, or what is the Syria policy of Belgium? Yeah, we can have our opinion about it, but will we be able to do something? Very little, unless as EU. So, and in the military, it's even more pronounced. Even France, now after Brexit, the militarily most powerful EU member state. Yeah, the French can deploy a brigade into Mali. You can say, compared with everybody else, that is very nice. At the global level, of course, that's nothing, one brigade. And even France can, if it wants to deploy that brigade urgently and all at once, then they need transport aircraft from other member states. So we cling to the illusion of national sovereignty in defense and foreign policy, which we lost 50 years ago or 70 years ago. But the idea is strong somehow. That to me is a bit of a paradox. So I don't think there is such integration overreach, to be honest. And you could say, in a way, where we have gone the furthest in integration and where it's supranational and the Commission is in charge and we use majority voting, that's where it works the best. It's where we have underreach, where it remains intergovernmental, that it doesn't work, right? That does not mean that every single policy area has to be dealt with at the EU level, right? I mean, I'm Belgian. We have created, you don't want to know how many policy levels we have created to deal with stuff, right? So sure. So to say, you are right. I'm not here. I'm not on the EU payroll, right? I'm not an EU propagandist. So I'm not here to say, oh, everything is fine. Come and join us. It's all perfect. No, there are severe challenges. What I think there's a certain disagreement about what the EU is now and what our type of society is. That I would say is the most fundamental problem. For me, Europe is about democracy, the rule of law, the free market, and equality. That is Europe. And equality in security, politics, and economy. But if some governments now say, no, Europe is about illiberal democracy, that's of course a fundamental clash. And you cannot allow that to happen. So we must persevere and make sure that doesn't happen. You cannot say we join this club and then afterwards you want to challenge the basic identity of the club. Then you cannot expect that there will be no consequences then, right? You could say that's a sovereignty of the Hungarian government. Yeah, sure, but then il faut avoir le courage de ses opinions, and they must accept that there will be consequences. So yes, that will be a challenge for sure. Of course, Brexit is an enormous loss, right? You lose leverage because you lose a big member state. I think the UK loses even more because it's the same illusion. Global Britain. Nobody is waiting for global Britain in the world, right? If you travel to China, yeah, they see Brexit as a great opportunity because say, now we can squeeze them because they will need a new economic agreement, but they will be in a much weaker negotiating position. So it's great, Brexit, but nobody cares what the British foreign policy will be on the Korean Peninsula, for example, or about the South China Sea, because it will be a position without power. So yeah, but you have a seat in the Security Council. Yeah, but you got that seat because back then you had power. If the power is gone and you maintain the trappings of it, it's nice, right? But the fact of having the seat doesn't give you power. Belgium has the temporary seat. We're in the Security Council. It doesn't automatically give us power, right? So all these illusions, I think we ought to get rid of. Very briefly on Russia, as I said, we should be careful. I think that we stick to a strong unified position, certainly also on Russia, and that we don't take rash initiatives that would sort of deepen the divide within the EU. But I don't know, I find it difficult to be optimistic about this because we have a cooperation now with the Russian Academy of Sciences, and every year they come to Brussels, we go there, speak with lots of Russian colleagues, and I say many of the academic colleagues, they also say, yeah, it would really be in the Russian interest to normalize relations with the EU. They never say with the US, but with the EU. But the blockage is on their side, basically, right? The blockage, I think, is not on our side. And if you've seen Mr. Putin's recent constitutional reshufflements, I mean, I thought we were creative with the Belgian constitution, but he's even more creative, right? Yeah, I don't predict any short-term change there, unless that they become really even more nervous about China, because I think there the rhetoric and the facade is that they're close friends and allies, but in reality there are enormous tensions also, and maybe we should play a little bit more into that also, right? I mean, I don't see myself as Kissinger, you know, driving a wedge between Beijing and Moscow, but and of course they will stay partners, but there's also enough friction, I think, for others like us to play a bit into that and to say to the Chinese, yeah, you know, the Russians with all their interventions, it's difficult to do business if they start a war, right? And to the Russians to say, yeah, how do you feel about all the Chinese investment in Georgia and so on and so forth? We could do more. Finally, very briefly, for the moment, I'm still allowed to enter the United States, so that's all right. I get my share of visits also from American diplomats who try to convince me that PESCO and EDF, it's all bad, and if America builds drones, why should Europe build drones? So yeah, sure, we can say America builds aircraft, so let's close Airbus, all by Boeings, or maybe not, seeing that they're apparently not always so good quality. So yeah, I think at a basic level there's still a lot of mutual understanding there. I'm going to the US in March, but to Hawaii actually, which is part of the US, for a really important academic conference, where I shall make the same points. Thank you. Cheers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sven, for an excellent presentation and for responding so well to all the questions. Thank you also to the audience for your participation. So I think we end here. Thank you. Again.
Thanks.
That was great. Yeah, right.